I'm Lisa Simeone. Today, we understand better than ever that the exploration of space is a risky business. The explosions of the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1986 and Columbia in 2003 made that clear. But in 1967, most Americans saw space as nothing more than a big adventure. The danger seemed beyond imagining. In this program, we go back to the disaster that almost derailed the Apollo program and America's drive to put a man on the moon. The tragedy of Apollo 1, now long forgotten. How it revealed deep flaws in a NASA management structure that business and governments around the world viewed with envy. And how NASA's attempts to cover over those flaws fed into congressional distrust that almost crushed the space program. From producer Richard Paul, Washington Goes to the Moon, Trials and Fire, coming up after this hour's news. From Soundprint and WAMU at American University in Washington, D.C., this is Washington Goes to the Moon. In this program, producer Richard Paul looks at the fire on Apollo 1 that killed 3 astronauts and the dramatic political story behind the race to the moon. The program is called Trials and Fire.
One of the year's most graphic filmings. The failure of this Atlas missile in California was discounted by many later U.S. successes.
No one ever questions that the exploration of space is a risky business.
Watch as, just clearing the 20 feet from its sunken pad, called a coffin, the missile is exploded.
Human beings sit atop what are essentially huge Roman candles, giant tubes filled with highly combustible mixtures of gases designed to send them hurtling millions of miles. And everyone involved in the space program, at least in theory, is always prepared for the worst. As space pioneer Wernher von Braun put it,
"This reminds one again that we are not in the business of making shoes."
The Atlas, which was to have been the first of its type to be launched from the new test tunnel, was conceived to travel 4,000 miles down the Pacific Missile Range. No one was injured.
The way an engineer learns is by making mistakes.
American University space historian Howard McCurdy.
They find out why they make the mistakes, they fix it, and they fly again. And then they make more mistakes, and they learn from that.
One caveat to that.
NASA chief historian Roger Lanius.
Mostly when they make mistakes, they're not catastrophic failures.
Try as they might, though, in the early days, NASA had its share of accidents and its share of tragedy. Robert Siemens was the agency's deputy administrator in the Apollo years.
The accidents that I can think of offhand were when 2 astronauts are coming in their jet. They weren't right over the runway and they didn't make it. They went into a building. And then a near accident we had was with Neil Armstrong and Gemini 8.
That came in 1966 and gave Siemens and others lessons that would serve them well the following year.
Man, David, is it really? Station.
Roger, how you doing?
Station keeping at about 150 feet.
This is the first time that we're going to physically dock with another vehicle, an unmanned vehicle to be sure, an Agena.
Okay, Gemini 8, you're looking good on the ground. Go ahead and dock.
I wanted to make sure that they were docked before leaving for going to a big, I guess the Wright Brothers dinner or something of that sort. It's one of these big Washington, D.C. functions with, I would guess, 1,500 people, black tie, with the vice president, Humphrey, as a speaker. And I was sitting right next to him at the head table.
And he's really a smoothie.
Oh, Roger. Hey, congratulations. This is real good.
Now, when I went to the dinner, everything was just fine. The docking took place on schedule. It was going very well. I did not have a radio in the car to listen. Nobody called me on the telephone in the car, so when I drew up to the hotel, there was a sort of a gang of NASA people who descended on me and swept me into a room and briefed me on what was going on. I was told that we were in deep trouble.
The gate is split and blown them, but they can't seem to stop it or get them working.
Did I hear a stuck hand controller?
Neil and Dave Scott realized that they were starting to rotate in an uncontrolled way. They disconnected the Gemini 8 from the Agena, and then they started to spin up very rapidly. And they got up to a spin rate of 2 complete cycles a second.
Gemini 8, I have some new rescue data for you. You ready to copy?
Then they had to figure out how to de-spin. And the only recourse they had was to go to the controls that were normally used for re-entry.
Also, had a suggestion we might put out our docking bar and go up and tap it.
I had to notify everybody at the dinner that we had this problem, because I felt it would be leaking out because the networks were already carrying it. And so everybody there knew that we had this imminent disaster, a potential disaster.
I shall do my utmost.
When Humphrey started to speak, he said, now I hope that we'll have good news before I finish my speech. And I was getting frequent information that was being brought to me from behind the podium. And Vice President Humphrey started speaking, and he was a very glib speaker, as you know. But even he was starting to wind down a little bit, and he kept looking at me, and I'd look at him and shake my head. And then I got a message that it had appeared that everything was under control, that they had de-spun the Gemini. So I nodded with him to make an announcement, which he did.
Hawaii, Capcom, Houston flight. Go flight. Roger.
It was a good lesson in the problems you can get into when you have a potential disaster.
Though there was little about accident procedure that was written down at NASA, Bob Siemens and everyone at the agency had been clear about what to do. NASA Administrator Jim Webb called it folding around.
Well, it's just that that's the way you did things in those days.
Glenn Wilson served 19 years as a staff member on the Senate Space Sciences Committee.
It doesn't many times make sense to bring in outside experts who may be experts in their field but don't know what the heck it is that you're doing.
This was the model NASA employed every time there was a problem. Appoint an internal accident review board. No outside interference, no public scrutiny, no press.
The normal procedure is that NASA would run the investigation.
NASA Chief Historian Roger Lanius.
The military has that procedure for when they have accidents with airplanes or tanks or ships or something like that. Generally speaking, the entity involved, the organization that is in charge of this, would run the investigation to find out what went wrong and to fix it.
A special ad hoc review board is established, which is empowered to delve into all aspects of the accident.
Bob Siemens.
And only when they are finished with their accident review are their results made public.
That's the way they did it for years. But on January 27th, 1967, this cozy arrangement would be shaken to its core.
Astronauts Virgil Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, America's first three-man space team, prepare to make the Pioneer Apollo flight scheduled within the next few weeks.
Death and disaster would hit hard and very close to home, and NASA's way of doing business would change forever.
They spend hours each day in their training capsule here at Cape Kennedy until it is as familiar as their own homes, and working the complex mechanism becomes second nature.
It was a test day. It was a normal work day for the astronauts and the engineers and the people associated with Apollo.
Computers set up problems in celestial environment, audio-visual tests, and the like, to give them the feeling of being in space long before they get there.
After a long day inside their capsule, numbered 204, the crew of Apollo 1 was running a test of their communications gear. It was just past 6:30 in the evening.
So, to repeat again, the tragedy at Cape Kennedy tonight has taken the lives of three of our astronauts, the men who were to be the first to fly in Apollo 1.
A flash fire developed in the command module within a very short period of time, less than 25 seconds. It had engulfed the capsule. The three men were killed in the process. It was a terrible, devastating tragedy for everybody involved.
The astronauts apparently died instantly, according to all reports we have been able to get so far. They were the first to be killed on the job and ironically died while on the ground.
As the fire burned at the Cape, Bob Siemens was on his way home from the White House, where there'd just been a pep rally to kick off the Apollo program. He was coming home for a celebration dinner.
I left the White House and went immediately home. And as I opened the door, my wife called out, Bobby, there's been an accident.
On the phone was the deputy director at the Cape.
I could tell immediately he was very, very upset. And his first words were something like, they're all gone. And I said, well, who's all gone? And he named the three astronauts who were lost in the fire, Grissom, White and Chaffee.
Killed in the blaze were Air Force Colonel Virgil I. Grissom, better known as Gus Grissom to most of the world. He was one of the 7 original Mercury astronauts. Along with him tonight, killed in the tragedy, were Air Force Colonel Edward White II, the first American to walk in space, and Navy Lieutenant Commander Roger B. Chaffee, a rookie awaiting his first flight in space.
Other NASA officials were at their own celebrations around Washington that night. George Miller, the director of manned spaceflight, was with NASA Administrator Jim Webb. His recollections were recorded in 1988 by the National Air and Space Museum.
We were just in the midst of dinner when the call came in saying there had been a disaster down at the Cape.
The fire was reported during what they call a plugs-out test of the booster and Apollo 1 craft. 3 hours after the fire, the bodies were still in the spacecraft, and as Jay Barber reported to us from Cape Kennedy a short time ago, the men have not yet been removed, or the bodies of the men.
We never did figure out what started the fire as such. Guess is that either somebody threw a switch that arced or pulled the wire out by mistake and it arced. And once an arc occurs in a pure oxygen environment, it's just amazing how fast those things burn.
There are a lot of unanswered questions, of course, and those will only come with time and investigation.
When you look at it in the aftermath, it seems fairly obvious what happened.
NASA historian Roger Lanius.
No one recognized it at the time, and that's important to understand. They had a pure oxygen environment in the capsule. That was standard. The pure oxygen is highly flammable, of course. There had been a whole series of Velcro strips, which are little plastic things, and everybody's seen Velcro, which is flammable. Then they closed the hatch on the capsule. They pressurized the capsule to the extent that it would be in orbit, which meant it was essentially a pressure cooker in that context. When you pressurize a pure oxygen environment, you have a spark, and you have these combustible materials like these Velcro strips. It essentially exploded.
At about the same time, the capsule itself burst.
And while Siemens declined to speculate here about how much worse the fire might have been, in an interview in 1988 with the National Air and Space Museum, he talked of a nearly cataclysmic explosion.
We could have killed everybody on the outside of the capsule. When that fire suddenly burst out, and you could see the scorching on the outside of the capsule, and there was the escape tower, on top of the capsule with the rockets in it that were there for the purpose of taking the astronauts away in the capsule if something happened just before or after liftoff. If that thing had ever exploded, I mean, my God, the whole damn pad would have gone.
Communication problems between the Apollo astronauts and the blockhouse developed and the flash fire occurred. Sources close to the project say the accident took place inside of the spacecraft itself and something ignited, and the Apollo's rare metals caught fire to produce tremendous heat.
From this launch pad, they were supposed to have started a ride in space late in February. They take the elevator for the last time to the Apollo capsule for an afternoon of rehearsal. 5 hours later, they are burned to death.
We have no trouble recalling the great tragedies of our day. We know exactly where we were when President Kennedy was assassinated or when the Challenger exploded. Strangely, though, outside the aerospace community, you'd be hard-pressed to find people who remember the fire on board Apollo 1. That's probably because, unlike Challenger, the Apollo 1 fire wasn't on TV. Make no mistake, though, the loss and the impact of the fire were as bad, if not worse, than after Challenger. NASA Chief Historian Roger Lanius.
It was an enormously devastating event for NASA. It destroyed the agency's self-confidence. That at a very fundamental level. How many things are we doing wrong if this is one thing that we did wrong?
People were prepared to lose astronauts on risky flights and missions. But this accident, frankly, was really stupid.
American University space historian Howard McCurdy.
This was something that a good management system should have picked up and should have prevented. And that's why it was so devastating. How could they be so foolish as to put people in a test at sea level in an all-oxygen environment? How could they be so foolish as to have no way of evacuating astronauts from a space capsule that had any kind of a difficulty at all? It's worth noting, by the way, that the astronauts did not burn to death. They died of asphyxiation. which made it even more imperative that there be some sort of system by which you could blow that capsule door and get people out. If they'd simply vented the oxygen that was inside the capsule, the folks inside would have coughed a little bit and probably been okay. There were all sorts of things that shouldn't have gone wrong if you had proper engineering or proper management, which we thought we had.
The NASA people who were involved after the fact, to the last person, said, they racked their brains, even to this day. What could I have done differently that would have prevented this from happening?
We tested all the rocket engines, we tested the stages, we tested everything up, down, and sideways, and the one thing we never tested was a capsule on fire.
The burned-out capsule holds somewhere in its charred wreckage the answer to the flash fire that in one searing instant took the lives of the three heroes and at the same time set back America's progress to the moon.
You're listening to Washington Goes to the Moon, Trials and Fire. I'm Lisa Simeone. We'll be back in 1 minute. You're listening to Washington Goes to the Moon, Trials and Fire, about the fire on board Apollo 1 that nearly derailed the space program. As we pick up our story, it's January 1967. The crew of Apollo 1 is dead. The capsule's a smoking ruin, and the cost of the Vietnam War is starting to exert pressure on the NASA budget. Here again is producer Richard Paul.
At the time of the Apollo 1 fire, NASA had 23 months to go to make President Kennedy's deadline of reaching the moon before the end of the decade. With the agency's reputation hanging in the balance, there was one imperative. They had to make sure the investigation, as it always had, would remain in-house. Former NASA Deputy Administrator Bob Siemens.
Things would move much more smoothly if we carried out the investigation, but we recognized that there's a danger in doing that people will say, well, the investigation is being carried out by the very people who ought to be investigated. And so the first step was to get in touch with the president and be sure that he was agreeable to having NASA take this responsibility.
Hello?
Yeah, Director Webb, was the president calling him?
He had called, Mr. Webb had called and left word.
While the flames were still being doused, NASA Administrator Jim Webb was on the phone to the president. His mission, reassure Johnson that everything was okay.
All right, we'll put him on. Okay. Just a minute, sir. Right.
Jim Webb, as the NASA administrator, was probably one of the most unique people in Washington in the 1960s.
NASA historian Roger Lanius.
Here is a fellow who was wired into the political establishment of the town like almost no one else. He came to Washington with Truman, in the Truman administration, became Truman's budget director, and then later an undersecretary of state. I mean, this fellow knew everyone in town, and he was a political master.
I just decided I wasn't going to bother you with a matter like this with all you had on you. Can I say one other thing?
Sure.
I called Dean Rust because we've been having a real problem here with the military, which I've called you once or twice, but you were either in foreign country or flying from California to Texas, and I knew that when the issue came up, we could get together.
It's in some respect a measure of the credibility that the agency had by the public and the confidence that the president had in Jim Webb as the NASA administrator, that he was able to negotiate with the president on the very day of the fire that NASA would run the investigation.
So sometime when you have a chance, let me know. But I wouldn't bother this speech now. I think I'd let it go on through.
No, I just want you to help on it. If they go to you, I don't want you all to get in a fight about it.
No, that's right.
In addition to being as wired in as any big-time operator could be in Washington, Jim Webb also had a legendary reputation as a manager. And he'd earned that reputation by showing NASA to be an agency that worked. Bob Siemens.
When people would say, how do you manage something? You say, you do it the way Jim Webb did at NASA.
But the Apollo 1 fire had raised serious doubts about Webb's ability.
Jim Webb talked about space-age management. He had developed all of these principles that he was trying to employ in terms of creating the perfect organization. He talked about the application of NASA space-age management techniques to other sorts of activities like homelessness and poverty. He thought that this was portable. And all of a sudden, this great management system collapsed.
There are two NASAs. There's a NASA before the fire, and there's a NASA after the fire.
American University's Howard McCurdy says the fire revealed huge flaws in a NASA corporate culture that Webb had constructed almost entirely on the basis of trust.
One of the problems of the fire was that it destroyed that trust between him and the engineers in the agency, and no longer was he willing to pass on their recommendations simply because 6 of them agreed.
As the wreckage was sifted, the search for answers began, and so did the search for someone to blame. Eyes began to shift and fingers began to point to the company that built the Apollo 1 capsule, North American Aviation, later called North American Rockwell, and then Rockwell International. Well before the fire, according to former NASA Deputy Administrator Bob Siemens, there'd been some frightening allegations of mismanagement at the company.
And it was decided to put together what is sometimes called a tiger team to get in there and turn over all the stones and see what's going on. The tiger team to go to North American and take a look sort of behind the scenes.
General Sam Phillips, director of the Apollo project for NASA, headed the tiger team. The confidential reports he brought back suggested that North American's work was dangerously slipshod. As the Apollo program had progressed through the 1960s, more and more work was what today we'd call outsourced. Responsibility, which before had been all NASA's, was now being delegated to the contractors. They were on a longer and longer leash. And historian Howard McCurdy says NASA engineers were beside themselves with frustration over North American.
Members of von Braun's rocket team are complaining that North American is not following the procedures and specifications set down by the Marshall Space Flight Center. In fact, they had a tradition of taking apart the rockets that North American made after North American delivered them to the Cape and making sure that North American had put them together correctly. Webb heard about this and he says, you got to quit doing that. You've got to quit intervening in what's contractor responsibility. The next month, one of the Germans showed up with a rag and showed it to Webb, waved it in his face. And he said, look, this is what we find inside the stuff that North American makes, as a way of reinforcing the old NASA tradition of very close supervision of contractors.
Those concerns were reinforced by the reports brought back by General Phillips' Tiger team. They painted an ugly picture of life at North American, an unfocused management team with too many other irons in the fire to concentrate on their work building the Apollo capsule, inadequate control of the production process, workers meeting schedules by not completing their work. Deep concern was expressed over the company's president, Lee Atwood, and about Harrison Storms, head of the Space Division. Atwood was said to be out of touch, Storms dismissive when problems were raised, and unwilling to admit that changes were ever needed. The reports were devastating. As NASA's director of manned spaceflight, George Miller, remembers,
it was so comprehensive that it would have been very difficult to explain why we were continuing to go on with Rockwell when they were doing such a terrible job.
As the investigation of the fire moved ahead, NASA Administrator Jim Webb had two concerns. First, find and fix the problems in his perfect organization. Second, make sure no one interfered from the outside. Howard McCurdy.
Webb was very concerned that this be done in-house because I think he understood how many enemies he had in the town by 1967 and how readily they would be able to seize upon this as an example of why NASA couldn't ever go to the moon and the funds ought to be cut off.
As George Miller remembers,
we began the process of damage control in the press because the people at the Cape were reluctant to begin disseminating knowledge that they didn't have. But of course the press was clamoring for, you can never give the press enough information.
It would turn out, though, that the press was only part of NASA's problem. As January turned to February, it was becoming increasingly clear that Webb's hope for a thoroughly internal investigation would not stand. While NASA might be able to control the press, Jim Webb couldn't control the Congress.
The committee will be in order. This is the second meeting of the committee with NASA to review the Apollo 204 accident, which occurred on January 27, 1967.
Exactly 30 days after the fire, the Senate Aeronautical and Space Sciences Committee opened hearings into the accident. While NASA filmed the hearings, the sound recording on that film has been lost. Actors read here from the hearing transcript.
Today, Mr. James E. Webb, Dr. Robert C. Siemens, Jr., and Dr. George E. Miller will discuss with the committee the interim findings of the Apollo 204 Review Board.
I was a new member of the Senate and a new member of that committee.
Former Vice President Walter Mondale.
I was starting to pick up comments from people in and around the program along two lines. One line was that they were having management problems. There were risks that were not being fully dealt with. And the second thing was a fear that they were having trouble with the private contractors, that they were in a hurry and might be taking some chances. All of this was pretty general.
All the members of this oversight committee were deeply concerned, even if they were committed to Apollo, about what had happened with the fire.
Roger Lanius.
And were looking for problems that might exist inside the agency.
On February 27th, Webb and his senior staff, Deputy Director Bob Siemens and George Miller, Director of Manned Spaceflight, were called before the Senate Space Committee. Paul Dembling was NASA's Director of Congressional Affairs.
Since we'd had a series of hearings on the subject of the fire, we were expecting more of the same.
But this was not to be the same old congressional investigation. As George Miller was to learn, too late, Senator Mondale had a surprise.
Somebody at North American sent in a letter, an anonymous letter, saying, well, there's this report that proves that this was sheerly a fault of the contractor. And it's a cover-up by NASA to keep this thing from escalating.
Mondale knew about General Phillips' secret Tiger Team reports.
A reporter came to me and told me that there was a report called the Phillips Report hidden in the NASA bureau there that had really criticized the management of the program for being haphazard, for being risky, and had been very critical of the private contractor who was in charge of the development of the space vehicle.
After a day of hard-hitting, though routine questions, it was Senator Mondale's turn to speak. Here, an actor reads what he said.
Let me preface this by saying that I have been told, and I would like to have this set straight if I am wrong, that there was a report prepared for NASA by General Phillips, completed in mid or late 1965, which very seriously criticized the operation of the Apollo program for multi-million-dollar overruns and for what was regarded as very serious inadequacies in terms of quality control.
Webb was asked that question at the hearings. He didn't know what Mondale was talking about.
Senate Space Committee staff member Glenn Wilson.
It wasn't as if there was a report said, Phillips report stamped on the top of it that Webb did not know about.
This report, among other things, was so critical that it recommended the possibility of searching for a second source, and as I am told, recommended Douglas aircraft.
He looked dazed and stunned.
Vice President Mondale.
And I still don't know whether he knew about it. I think he did.
Would you comment on that? Is there a Phillips report?
It turns out he didn't. During the entire time that the Tiger teams had been gathering information, Jim Webb, the administrator of NASA, the man in charge of the agency, had been kept almost completely in the dark about the specifics of the problems at North American. Bob Siemens.
For the life of me, I can't believe that I didn't keep him informed, but he claimed after the fire that nobody had ever told him about these problems, and that's one of the things I feel badly about, that at least he felt that he had been kept out of the loop.
When Mondale asked Miller, was there a Phillips report, the room fell silent.
Is it your testimony that there was no such unusual General Phillips report? Is that rumor unfounded?
Well, I know of no unusual General Phillips report. I do know that General Phillips has examined each of our contractors in the course of the program, and as a matter of fact, we have a yearly process of evaluating the contractor's structure, to be sure.
I was surprised, and Jim Webb was surprised when this Phillips report began to surface, because we had thought, I had thought it was carefully buried and destroyed, not the knowledge, but the report itself.
And we do from time to time have special reviews of contractor problems. I don't know of a specific report such as that.
Was there a report in which General Phillips recommended looking for a second source?
I do not recall such a report.
He said, wasn't there a report written about North America that indicated that they were not doing an exemplary job? And Mr. Webb referred that to George Miller, the question. And George said, no, there was no such report. And isn't that right, Sam? And Sam said, no report.
Well, they didn't. If you read what he said, he didn't quite say no. He said, well, we'll have to look into it or something like that.
Walter Mondale.
If you listen to Webb's answer, we'd be happy to make it available to the Comptroller General under any request that the committee of you would make.
This provides a certain measure of control of these reports, which I think permits you to get what you need, but still under proper control. I just don't want to say yes.
He's trying to think of every way he can to prevent producing it, but they did produce it.
I just don't want to say yes until I see the full problem involved in that.
Well, I'm not even sure such a thing. February 19th report.
I think it was November.
Whatever reports are of interest to this committee, we are prepared to establish the proper procedure for them.
Once you create a report like that, you can never really destroy it. Everybody has a secret copy.
What I am getting at is this allegation, this serious criticism made about this so-called Phillips report.
Are you thinking of a report circulated by a former employee of the company recently, within the last 6 weeks?
No. The so-called Phillips report came out mid or late 1965, conducted by NASA on the Apollo program.
Let us look it up.
Webb had been caught completely unprepared. As it turns out, NASA's congressional liaison, Paul Dembling, who also knew nothing about the Tiger Team reports, could have known and could have briefed his boss, if only his timing had been a little better.
Well, the morning of the hearing, we had prepared to go up to the Hill. At the last minute, as I was walking out, General Sam Phillips's assistant came in and said, I have some documents here that I would like you to take a look at. I recognize you're on your way out, but when you get back, maybe we can talk about them.
Paul Dembling left the material sitting on his desk.
I said, okay, I'll take a look at it when I get back. I don't have now. I'm packing up. I'm leaving. It was maybe 2-3 minutes before I had to meet the administrator, Jim Webb, to go up to the Hill.
The hearing was a public relations nightmare for NASA. Roger Lanius.
As a result of this particular hearing, the NASA of NASA appeared in the newspaper the next day to mean, in response to Jim Webb's testimony, never a straight answer.
A member of the United States Senate had suggested that NASA was covering up. Mondale insinuated the agency knew all along about the problems at North American and was keeping it a secret from the American people. Serious questions were also raised about why North American was building the spacecraft in the first place. There were those who strongly suggested the stink of political influence, that the company was not the most qualified to be working on Apollo. Bob Siemens.
And at that point, I had a sense that Mondale wasn't just asking this as an exploratory basis, that he knew about something, and the question was what it was. And I felt that it probably had to do with this Tiger Team effort. And so I introduced the thought that we did periodically carry out extensive reviews of our contractors, and he might be referring to the result of one of those reviews.
So I cannot sit here as a lawyer. I am not a lawyer, and give you the ramifications of this. But I can tell you, as one who has been involved in development, that the release of this report would seriously impair our ability to prosecute work in the future.
I remember so clearly as I left there, Mr. Webb nailing me on the floor there of the hearing room and saying, I want you to come with me. And as soon as we got in the car, he had a window in it you could crank up between the driver and the back seat, and he cranked that window up. And he really turned on me, and he said there was no excuse for you volunteering information in that hearing. He said, we're dealing here with matters that can involve millions and millions of dollars of lawsuit, and this is not like the kind of friendly hearing that you're used to.
I get back into my office, I pick up what his assistant had left with me, and clearly it's what Mondale was talking about.
NASA Congressional Liaison Paul Dembling.
It's labeled, only typed on it, but it's labeled the Phillips Report. So I recognized that must be what Mondale was talking about, and I go rushing down to the administrator's office.
He stopped first, though, in Bob Seaman's office and shared the news of his findings.
So I said, well, there's the report. Take it. It's what I sort of suspected. Take it into the boss.
It was only now, according to NASA historian Roger Lanius, after everything that had been said openly in front of a Senate committee, that Bob Seamans tells Jim Webb about what General Phillips and his Tiger teams had found.
Bob Seamans tells him, well, there was an investigation in 1965, and Sam Phillips conducted the investigation. He didn't feel that there was a necessity that this be brought to Webb's attention. And he said, oh my gosh, there is a Phillips report. I have lied to the Congress.
You're listening to Washington Goes to the Moon, Trials and Fire. I'm Lisa Simeone. We'll be back in 1 minute. You're listening to Washington Goes to the Moon, Trials and Fire, about the fire on board Apollo 1 that nearly derailed the space program. It's the winter of 1967. Senator Walter Mondale has learned the NASA administrator knew about what led to the fire, but that he'd misled the Senate Investigating Committee about it. Here's producer Richard Paul.
For 3 months after the disclosure of General Sam Phillips' report about the problems with North American Aviation, the company that built the Apollo 1 command module, Senator Mondale, along with Senator Edward Brooke of Massachusetts and Senator Margaret Chase Smith of Maine, would use the so-called Phillips report to pummel NASA and North American about what they knew, what they didn't know, what they did and what they didn't do in the months and years leading up to the Apollo 1 fire.
My recollection is that they really wanted to cover it up. They didn't want to get into it. They didn't want to disclose it. They didn't want a public discussion about the problems that the space program was into. And so I kept pressing them. But I think that, I don't want to take credit for it myself, but I think that by forcing a public confrontation, it forced NASA to restructure and reorganize the program in a way that was much safer.
Meanwhile, in the House, things were also looking bleak for NASA. In one of the more bizarre episodes to come out of the Apollo 1 fire, a House Oversight Subcommittee convened in Florida to talk with employees of North American. There's no known recording of this hearing, but the transcript, which was thought to be lost, turned up recently at the Library of Congress.
There were 400,000 people working for NASA at the height of the Apollo program. And yes, somebody had written some materials that criticized practices at the contractor. And after the accident, these materials came forth. And what had been, before that, a fairly low-level engineer suddenly became somebody with great foresight and was called to present the material that was contained in these memos.
There were all kinds of stories going around at the time about the Apollo program, some of them still alive today, that fall into the realm of conspiracy theory. Nonetheless, they had an impact on public opinion. One of them comes out of this House hearing.
Will you give your full name and your address?
Thomas Ronald Barron, 2856 Folsom Road, Mims, Florida.
Now take just a few minutes and tell us something about your background.
As far as my background goes, I've been in research and development for approximately the last 12 years.
It's not clear that he sent a report to the House committee. You see references throughout the literature on an Apollo program to a 500-page report. I have never seen such a report. It's not in the NASA History Office files. Apparently it's not in the congressional files, and that's part of the mythology that comes out of this particular episode and gives rise to all kinds of conspiracy theories.
Thomas Barron was a high school-educated inspector at Cape Kennedy with a reputation as a complainer. He'd written hundreds of memos about work and other employees' behavior that he considered sloppy. Some of it was nonsense. Much of it was not.
Mr. Barron, I've read your first report. I believe it was the 50-odd page report, and I've listened to about 2.5 hours of taped interviews of yours. One of the statements that you made was that non-certified items were placed in the spacecraft. The review board found that non-certified equipment items were installed in the command module at the time of the test. It was testified in Washington that a number of these items were identified and known and were to be taken out before the flight. Of these items that you spoke of, do you know whether these were the same items that would have been taken out before flight?
No, sir. I don't see how they could actually be taken out. Some of them were in the epoxy category and paint category and tape category. Possibly the tape could be removed. We use some tape for identification purposes in the command module, which could be removed during flight.
Do you think the items you were speaking of would have stayed in during flight if the capsule had flown?
Yes.
They were talking to just an inspector who had, for reasons of his own, prepared memorandum at the time before the accident detailing what he thought to be shoddy practices, and suddenly finds himself thrust into the national limelight in front of a major congressional investigating committee.
You're saying that you don't know anything about this personally, but you're indicating somebody might have said something to you about it. Is that right?
Definitely.
You don't feel that you want to discuss that with the committee at this time?
Well, I would be more than happy to say it if Mr. Heckler would take a more objective view of the statements.
Well, I can't answer for Mr. Heckler, but I would like to hear it.
Yes, sir. I'll be more than happy to.
Please, tell us.
Well, I discussed it with another individual at his home, and he witnessed one evening when he was working 3 technicians who were supposed to flush out. This is by purging the environmental control unit with an alcohol solution to apparently clean it and get it ready for proper use. He disclosed to me that a 55-gallon drum had been delivered to the site.
Barron is also responsible for giving rise to a lot of urban legends, if you will, about the space program. One of the more widely circulated legends is that the workers at the pad were drinking on the job. Now, he didn't see anybody drinking, but what would happen is that the cleaning fluid, which was ethyl alcohol, distilled spirits, would disappear after a cleaning episode. So he concluded that somebody was making jungle juice with the ethyl alcohol. And then, of course, that would help to explain why the workmanship was shoddy.
One of them took a 5-gallon jug of this stuff home, and the other, or perhaps all 3 of them, I don't really recall right now, had mixed this stuff and cut it with water and were drinking it right here at the site. And they were carrying it around in plastic bags.
Well, that doesn't have anything to do with this particular wire or this particular door.
Well, possibly so, because they were working on that unit and the spacecraft. And this is the only link I could put between them, between what you have there and the drinking.
Barron had a reputation for mental instability, something members of the subcommittee were all too happy to make public, but nonetheless, his charges could not be dismissed out of hand. And then, days after the hearing,
he died. He was killed in what was officially reported as a railway accident, crossing a railway trestle and hit by a train, with, I believe, members of his family. And, of course, since he'd been one of the leading critics before the House committee, the conspiracy theorists immediately assumed that he had been picked out by the CIA or some other organization as someone who knew too much.
It's difficult to imagine in our current media age, but Barron's story never really made it much outside of Florida.
His testimony gives rise to all kinds of legends and things that he himself did not even say. And, of course, his eventual demise just adds to the conspiracy theory.
Nevertheless, when the congressional hearings finally ended, Jim Webb knew he had succeeded. He had kept public outcry and its consequent congressional fury to a minimum. In fact, the Senate committee, in its final report, said that the findings of General Phillips' Tiger teams, quote, had no effect on the accident, did not lead to the accident, and were not related to the accident. But the same could not be said for the handling of General Phillips' findings. The aftermath of the hearings on the people inside NASA, the finger-pointing, backstabbing, the self-doubt and recrimination, ruined working relationships and ruined careers. It did almost as much to damage the Apollo project as the fire itself.
Oh, gosh, it was just turbulent.
Howard McCurdy.
First of all, the signal that came down to Jim Webb and everybody at the top was, you can't fail again. Plus the fact they're 18 months behind schedule for the end of the decade deadline. The only way they can make that up is by taking huge risks. And then there was the huge question, what do we do with North American? Do we fire them? And a lot of people in NASA wanted to fire them, but then they were told if we start with a brand new contractor, there's no way they can be ready by the end of 1969.
At that point in time, the problems between Jim Webb and Bob Siemens come to the fore. Webb came to the conclusion that he couldn't really trust some of his senior people around him, and one of those was Bob Siemens. He felt betrayed. I don't think that there's any other way to say it. He felt like he had been betrayed by that leadership team, led by Bob Siemens. His reaction to Bob Siemens thereafter was hostile, to say the least.
At first, he would bring up things about others, like George Miller and others, and say, they've sort of let us down, haven't they? And I'd say, well, you got to realize what they've accomplished. But then a few people came to me and said, you got to realize that up on the Hill, what he's saying about others, he's also saying about you. And so it just seemed to me that the situation was not too favorable for NASA if I stuck around. So sometime in the fall, I felt that it was time to move on and do something else.
At least Siemens was able to make his own decision.
Joe Shea, who was the NASA person who was overseeing the command module, was relieved of his responsibilities. North American, Harrison Storms was removed as the president of the division that was building the Apollo capsule. Another person was put into his place. There were a variety of individuals in lesser capacities that were also replaced at the particular time.
And an odd sidelight to the whole affair was the toll that it took on the reputation of Senator Mondale. Though there's not a shred of evidence to prove it, there's an urban myth which has grown up and which cannot be dislodged that Walter Mondale tried to destroy the Apollo program. The story was placed even more firmly in America's mind by From the Earth to the Moon, Tom Hanks' saga of the Apollo program, which aired on HBO in 1997. In the episode dealing with the fire on Apollo 1, Mondale is the villain. In this clip from the film, the actor playing Mondale talks with the actor portraying Jim Webb.
Do you really want to kill Apollo?
I'm sorry, Mr. Webb, but I've got a job to do, and I'm going to do it.
With all due humility, Senator, what did we do wrong?
Well, that's what I'm going to find out.
No, I mean, why are you so down on us? You and I are both Democrats. Going to the moon was Kennedy's dream.
It was one of his dreams. Jack Kennedy had a lot of dreams.
You know, I was so hurt, I didn't even look at it. I didn't have the stomach to look at it, but somebody came up to me after they saw this Tom Hanks thing, and they said they just made a monster out of you. And I just didn't have the heart to look at it. I don't know what explains the virulence of some of this. Here we are, it's almost 30 years later, but I apparently touched some pretty raw nerves.
And as for the man who'd hoped one day to make his management style the template for the entire federal government, the Apollo 1 fire claimed Jim Webb's career as a victim too. Howard McCurdy.
He'd gone to the ranch with Lyndon Johnson. He pleaded for more money. He said, I need another $500 million or I can't guarantee the safety of the landing. And the White House and the Congress didn't appropriate that money. He did the best he could. I think he was tired from the budget battles, and I think he probably inside his own mind worried that maybe they had gone too fast or cut too many corners.
All of us here tonight jointly share the responsibilities for the human frailties which are now so apparent, and for the insidious combination of materials and equipment which was so devastating in their behavior.
Astronaut Alan Shepard, in a dinner marking the 6th anniversary of his flight as the first man in space, sent the word forth. NASA is down, but not out. Apollo will reach the moon by the end of the decade.
The time for recrimination is over. We have digested enough historical evidence. There is much to be done. Morale is high. Vision is still clear. And I say, let's get on with the job.
And get down to it they did, beginning first with a complete redesign of the Apollo capsule. George Miller.
That whole capsule had to be rewired. And of course that took time, energy, and effort. And just simply getting everybody going in the same direction at the same time was a major challenge.
Up to this point, NASA had tried to use what was called incremental testing. That is, you tested each piece of the rocket and the spacecraft one at a time. George Miller, after the accident, said, we've got to go to all-up testing, in which you stack the Saturn V rocket with all 3 stages, you put the Apollo capsule on top of it, and you fire the whole thing. Now, if anything goes wrong with the first or second stage, you don't get any test results on everything that's above it. People in NASA said this is crazy, this will never work, it's too risky. Miller insisted they go ahead with it, and on November 9th, 1967, they conducted the first all-up test of the Saturn V launch vehicle, and everything worked.
Roger. And at the same time,
The clock was ticking, and despite and even operating under a new no-risk environment, NASA forged ahead.
I can see the entire Earth now out of the center window. I can see Florida.
Think of what happened in 1968. In 1968, NASA conducted the second test of the Saturn V rocket, the second time they'd flown it, and it didn't work. There was a rupture in one of the fuel lines. There was a shutdown on the second stage engines. The rocket oscillated and vibrated uncontrollably. The next time we flew a Saturn V rocket, we sent 3 astronauts on a Christmas Eve voyage around the moon. That was a terrible risk. I really wonder if NASA would have taken that risk if they didn't have the compressed schedule and the deadline looming before them.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour.
I think you could say, tragic as it was, if we had not had the accident then, we would not have gone to the moon within the decade.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Trials and Fire was written and produced by Richard Paul. The music was composed and arranged by Lenny Williams. Research assistance provided by David Angst. Walter Mondale's interview was recorded by Mark Zadeklik. We would also like to thank Arlene Seidel at the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee. The congressional testimony was recreated by actors Porter Kuntz, Andy Clements, Michael Forrest, Brad Van Grack, Michael Thornton, and Michael Skinner. Washington Goes to the Moon originally aired as part of Soundprint's Exploring Space Science, a series funded in part by the National Science Foundation, NASA, WAMU-FM, WABE-FM, and the Morehouse School of Medicine. Thanks for listening. I'm Lisa Simeone.